It was 3 o'clock in the morning on the 26th of October, 1942, and the rain had not stopped for hours. On a low ridge above the Matanikau River, about 4 miles from the airstrip the Marines called Henderson Field, Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Page lay behind a .30 caliber machine gun and listened. Down the muddy slope in front of him, where the Kenai grass gave way to a black ravine, a string of empty ration cans began to rattle. He had strung those cans on a trip wire himself a few hours earlier. Now they were singing. 33 men of his machine gun platoon held the saddle. Below them, in the ravine, a reinforced Japanese regiment was getting to its feet. The question that would be answered before sunrise was a brutally simple one. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how one man came to be lying behind that gun, you have to go back 6 years and halfway around the world. Mitchell Page was born on the 31st of August, 1918, in Charleroi, Pennsylvania, a mill town on the Monongahela River south of Pittsburgh. His parents were immigrants, ethnic Serbs who had come from Herzegovina, and his mother raised her sons on stories of the old country while telling them to be proud Americans. As a boy, Page looked forward all year to the Armistice Day Parade. He watched the veterans of the First World War march down the main street in their ribbon-decorated uniforms, and he decided early that he wanted to wear a uniform of his own. When he turned 18, in the late summer of 1936, he enlisted in the Marine Corps. He went through recruit training at Parris Island, South Carolina, the way every Marine did, and from there the Peacetime Corps sent him out into the world. He served aboard a battleship as a gunner. He went to the Philippines, where he played on a service baseball team that became locally famous. And in October 1938, he shipped to China, to Peking, where he joined the small Marine detachment guarding the American embassy in the old imperial city. That posting mattered, because it was where Page first met the thing he would later face on the ridge. The Second Sino-Japanese War had broken out the year before, and the Japanese army was pushing deeper into China. Page pulled duty as an armed guard on the supply trains that ran from Shanghai up to Peking, riding the cars as they rolled through a countryside at war. From the train, he saw Japanese soldiers killing Chinese civilians, casually and without consequence. It was his first encounter with the ferocity of the army he would one day fight, and it was an education no training manual could give him. He left China behind in 1940 and came home to a Marine Corps that was beginning slowly to prepare for a much larger war. Page was folded into the brand-new 1st Marine Division and assigned to the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marine Regiment, under a lieutenant colonel named Herman Hannikin. By the time the division shipped out, Page was a platoon sergeant in a machine gun company, and he had been a machine gunner for 6 years. That experience showed in how he ran his men. The weapon at the center of his world was the Browning water-cooled machine gun, a heavy, belt-fed .30 caliber gun with a metal jacket around the barrel that held water to keep it from melting under sustained fire. It was not a glamorous weapon. It was heavy. It took a crew to carry and feed it, and it demanded constant care. Page insisted that every Marine in his platoon be able to take that gun apart and put it back together blindfolded. He demanded the same of the 1903 Springfield rifle and the .45 caliber pistol. Take it apart, reassemble it in the dark by feel. Every man. He understood something that would matter enormously on a rain-soaked ridge in the middle of the night, when a gun jammed or a barrel ran dry and there was no light to work by. A machine gunner who needed to see his weapon was a dead machine gunner. The reason any of them were on Guadalcanal at all came down to a strip of dirt. In the first half of 1942, the Japanese began building an airfield on Guadalcanal, an island in the Solomons that almost no American had heard of. An airfield that would let Japanese aircraft cut the long ocean supply line between the United States and Australia. So on the 7th of August, 1942, roughly 11,000 Marines went ashore on Guadalcanal and the small neighboring islands. It was the first major American ground offensive of the war, the first time the United States stopped retreating in the Pacific and started taking ground back. The landing went better than anyone expected, and then it went very badly. The Marines seized a half-finished airfield almost immediately, and that western flank, the Matanikau line, was the dangerous one, because it was the only ground over which the Japanese could bring vehicles. The sector sat about 4 miles west of Henderson Field. By the middle of October, 2 Marine battalions held a high ground on the east side of the river near the coast. The Americans had even captured a Japanese map, showing that 3 enemy divisions intended to attack the perimeter from 3 separate directions. They could see the Japanese building up to the west and the south. What they did not expect was an attack swinging in from the east behind their river line. The man planning that hook was a commander of the Japanese 17th Army, Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake, and the centerpiece of his offensive was the 2nd Division, a proud unit nicknamed the Sendai Division. Its commander, Lieutenant General Masao Murayama, took roughly 7,000 men and tried to march them through the jungle south of the airfield to fall on the American line from behind. It was a nightmare of a march. The trail Murayama's engineers cut through the rainforest was barely a path. He believed his men were about 4 miles from the airfield, when they were actually closer to 8. The troops ran low on food and went on to half rations. The big attack was postponed and then launched anyway, in piecemeal waves against the southern face of the perimeter on the nights of the 24th and 25th of October, where another battalion of the 7th Marines held the line. Those assaults were thrown back with terrible Japanese losses, more than 300 men killed in the first night's attacks alone. While Murayama drove at the perimeter from the south, a separate force was ordered to come in from the west and the rear. Colonel Ikinasuke Oka commanded a reinforced regiment, the 124th Infantry. On the 19th of October, Oka received his orders. He was to cross to the east bank of the Matanacaw, strike the 2 Marine battalions on the river line from the flank and the rear, and seize the high ground beyond. If he succeeded, there was very little between his men and the beach road that ran straight to the airfield. On the morning of the 24th of October, American observers spotted Japanese infantry massing in the thickly wooded ravine south of the Matanacaw positions. The threat to that east-west ridgeline was suddenly real. So General Vandegrift, the division commander, gave the order on the 25th for Hannikin's 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines to make a forced march from his position near Henderson Field out to the threatened ridge. Sergeant Page and his 33 machine gunners fell in with the rest of the battalion and tramped rapidly westward, carrying their guns, their tripods, their water cans, and belt after belt of ammunition through the heat and the mud. The battalion reached its assigned ground in the early evening of the 25th, and the welcome was immediate. Japanese howitzers on the west bank of the Matanacaw began dropping shells onto the ridge, and Japanese destroyers offshore added their fire from the sea. The 3 rifle companies spread out along the high ground from west to east. Company E held the lower hill on the western end. Company G held the saddle in the center. Company F held the higher hill to the east. And in the gap between Company F and Company G, Page set up his machine guns. He sighted them carefully, the way 6 years of training had taught him. He placed his gun so their fire would protect Company F on his left and Company G on his right, knitting the 2 hills together across the dip in the middle. He had 4 guns, and he positioned each one to cover the slope where the land fell away toward the ravine. Then, with the rain coming down hard and the enemy shells still searching the ridge, he crawled out in front of his own position and strung his tripwire. He hung empty C-ration cans along it at intervals, and into each can he dropped an empty cartridge case, so that anything brushing the wire in the dark would set the cans rattling and the cartridges clinking. It was a crude alarm improvised in the mud, and it would prove to be one of the most important things he did all night. The Marines lobbed mortar rounds down into the ravine where they knew the Japanese were gathering, tried to thin the ranks before the assault came. Then they hunkered down in the rain and waited. The waiting did not last. At 3 o'clock in the morning on the 26th of October, Oka's regiment came up out of the ravine and hit Hannikin's battalion all along the ridge. The cans on Page's wire rattled their warning, and then the night came apart. The hardest blow fell on Company F, on the higher hill to the east, where the Japanese surged up the slope in the dark and crashed straight into the Marine line. Within minutes, the fighting was hand-to-hand, men grappling in the rain and the mud, bayonets and rifle butts and knives, muzzle flashes strobing across a hillside no one could see. In the middle of it, a Japanese soldier lunged at Page out of the darkness and drove a bayonet straight at his head. There was no time to bring a weapon around. Page threw up his left hand to block the thrust, and the razor edge of the blade bit deep into his hand, slicing into the flesh and very nearly taking his fingers off. In the same instant, Before the man could draw back for a second thrust, Page pulled his K-bar fighting knife and drove it into his attacker's neck, killing him where he stood. The sergeant had been on the ridge for a matter of hours. The fight was minutes old, and already his gun hand was laid open to the bone, and the men of his platoon were beginning to fall around him in the dark. To understand why a few hundred yards of ridge mattered that much, you have to see what was happening all around it. By the middle of October 1942, the Americans on Guadalcanal were, in the words of the men who were there, hanging on to the island by their fingernails. The Japanese had concentrated some 20,000 troops for an all-out, two-pronged assault on the airfield, scheduled to open on the night of the 23rd of October and directed on the ground by General Maruyama. To prepare the way, the Imperial Navy had pounded Henderson Field directly. On the nights of the 13th and 14th of October, Japanese battleships and cruisers had stood off the coast and shelled the airfield for hours, destroying dozens of aircraft and burning precious stores of fuel. A sailor who lived through it remembered the whistling, and then the explosions, going on for 4 hours without pause. The airfield that the entire campaign turned on had very nearly been wrecked from the sea before Murayama's infantry ever stepped off, and the bombardments were only the dramatic edge of a slower kind of suffering. The Marines on Guadalcanal had been worn thin for weeks by the island itself. They lived in mud, in heat, in jungle that pressed in from every direction, on an island where the climate was as much an enemy as the Japanese. Malaria and dysentery moved through the ranks. Rations were short and monotonous, sometimes captured Japanese rice eaten because there was nothing else. At night, the Tokyo Express ran fresh enemy troops down to the island, while American ships could not safely stay in the waters offshore. So the men holding perimeter knew the odds against them were being topped up in the dark, run after run. By the time Page's battalion made its forced march to the ridge, these were not fresh troops settling into a strong position. They were tired, sick, hungry men digging into wet ground in the rain, asked to hold against an enemy who kept arriving. That is a condition in which the stand on the saddle was made. That condition had been weeks in the making, and the first blow had fallen at sea only 2 days after the Marines came ashore. The landings on the 7th of August, 1942, which put the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal as the opening move of America's first offensive of the war, had gone almost too smoothly. The Marines seized a half-built airfield in a matter of days. Then, in the dark early hours of the 9th of August, a Japanese cruiser force came down the channel the Americans called a slot and fell on the Allied warships, screening the landing off Savo Island. The Japanese Navy was superbly trained for night combat and carried the finest torpedoes in the world. And in roughly half an hour of point-blank gunnery and torpedo, fire had shattered the Allied screen. 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sunk and more than 1,000 sailors killed, while the Japanese lost not a single ship in the engagement itself. It was the worst open-sea defeat in the history of the United States Navy, and it gave that stretch of water the grim name the men would use for the rest of the campaign, Iron Bottom Sound. The disaster off Savo did not only cost ships. It cost the men ashore their lifeline. With the screening force wrecked, the American transports and the surviving warships pulled out earlier than planned, before they had finished unloading, and for a time they handed the waters around Guadalcanal to the enemy. The Marines were left on the island with only part of their supplies, their equipment, and their food, and with a hard knowledge that the Navy had been driven off and could not be counted on to return quickly. From the very first week, the men holding Henderson Field were, in a real and frightening sense, on their own. What followed through August and September was a pattern that the October assault was meant, at last, to break. The Japanese kept feeding troops onto the island by night, and kept hurling them at the perimeter, and kept badly underestimating the men they were attacking. In late August, the first major ground assault came at a stream the Marines called the Tenaru, where an overconfident Japanese force charged straight into Marine line, and was all but annihilated in a single night and morning of fighting. In the middle of September came the larger and more dangerous attempt, on a low spine of ground running south from the airfield. There a force of Marine raiders and parachutists under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson held the high ground through 2 nights of furious assault, taking and inflicting such punishment that the place has carried the name ever since Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge. The line bent there almost breaking and held. Each of those fights taught the same lesson, and each time the Japanese command seemed to refuse to learn it. They believed that fighting spirit and the shock of a night attack would carry the day against an enemy they convinced themselves was soft, and each time the sheer volume of disciplined American defensive fire, the rifles and the machine guns and the artillery, tore the assault apart in front of the line. By October, the Japanese were preparing to try once more, on a far greater scale, and with a fresh and proud division. But the script they meant to follow had already failed twice. Page's saddle would be one of the places where it failed a third time, and this time for good. It is hard to overstate how much rode on the airfield itself. Henderson Field was not just a runway scraped out of the jungle. As long as American planes could fly from it, they could strike at Japanese ships trying to reach the island by daylight, which is exactly why the enemy had been reduced to running troops down at night by destroyer. The little collection of aircraft operating from the field, which the men had taken to calling the Cactus Air Force after the island's code name, was the reason the Japanese could not simply sail in and crush the beachhead. The airfield was a hinge the entire campaign turned on. Whoever held it held the air over the southern Solomons, and whoever held the air held the advantage at sea. The Japanese understood this every bit as clearly as the Americans did, and by the middle of October 1942, they had resolved to take it back by force. To do it, the commander of the Japanese 17th Army, Lieutenant General Harakichi Hakatake, had built his strength on the island up to something like 20,000 troops. The spearhead of the offensive was the 2nd Division, the Sendai Division, one of the proudest and most experienced formations in the Japanese Army. The plan was to overwhelm the marine perimeter with coordinated assault from more than one direction at once, break it open, and seize the airfield, after which Japanese aircraft would fly into the captured base, and the long American gamble on Guadalcanal would be finished. The confidence behind that plan ran extraordinarily high, so high that midway through the offensive, on the 25th of October, Japanese commanders convinced themselves their troops had already taken Henderson Field, and sent warships forward toward Guadalcanal to exploit the supposed victory. The truth was the reverse. The field was still firmly in American hands and still flying, and aircraft from that very field attacked the approaching ships during the day and sank a light cruiser. The planes the offensive was supposed to have silenced were instead sinking the ships sent to celebrate its success. It was a small but telling measure how badly the attack had already gone. Even before Oka's regiment reached Page's Ridge that night, from inside the perimeter, though none of that was visible to the men who actually had to stop the Sendai Division, it was simply weeks of shelling, sickness, and short rations, and the certain knowledge that a large and determined enemy was gathering in the jungle for a blow everyone knew was coming and no one could prevent. The only questions left were where the hammer would fall, and whether the thin lines of Marines would still be standing when the sun came up. Maruyama's own approach had been an ordeal in its own right, and it shaped the attack before a shot was fired. To strike the perimeter from the south, his Sendai Division had to move through some of the worst jungle on the island, along a track his engineers hacked out barely wide enough for men to pass in single file. The troops hauled their weapons and ammunition by hand up muddy ridges and down into steep ravines, and much of the heavy artillery that was meant to support the assault had to be abandoned along the way, because it simply could not be dragged through. Maruyama had badly misjudged the distance as well, believing the airfield far closer than it actually was. So the march dragged on longer than planned, and the attack had to be put off more than once. By the time his exhausted, hungry men, already on half rations to stretch their dwindling food, finally reached the American lines, they were arriving without much of the fire support the whole plan had assumed. When they finally attacked, they threw themselves against the southern face of the perimeter, where another battalion of the 7th Marines, badly outnumbered, held a long line in the dark and broke wave after wave of them. Page's Ridge to the west and that southern line were two faces of the same desperate 48 hours. Both had to hold. If either gave way, the airfield was lost. It is worth understanding what those assaults were actually like, because the experience of standing against them is the thing the citations can never quite convey. The Japanese Army of 1942 attacked at night, and attacked head-on, in mass formations driven forward by a doctrine that prized the spirit of the offensive above almost everything else. Men came out of the darkened waves, shouting, sometimes screaming a single word over and over to steel themselves and to unnerve the defenders, and they kept coming over the bodies of the men who had fallen ahead of them. Officers led with drawn swords. Soldiers who could no longer advance would sometimes charge position alone rather than fall back. Surrender was for most of them, simply not within the range of choices. The whole point of the tactic was to overwhelm a defending line through sheer shock and weight before its fire could do enough killing to stop the charge. Against disciplined, well-sighted defensive fire, it was a doctrine that produced appalling casualties for the attacker, and the Japanese paid in full to Tenaru on Edson's Ridge, on the southern perimeter, and on Page's Saddle. But it was also genuinely terrifying to face, and it worked often enough against thin or shaken lines to be deadly for the man behind the machine gun. Holding against it meant doing a very specific and very hard thing. It meant staying at the gun while the noise and the muzzle flashes and the screaming filled the dark, while the figures came up the slope faster than the bell could be fed, while the men beside him were being hit, and continuing to fire in a steady, aimed, disciplined stream rather than breaking and running. The water-cooled Browning could break a bonsai charge, but only if the man behind it did not break first. That, in the end, is what the battle came down to, position by position, all across the perimeter, on every one of those October nights. That Southern fight produced a story that has become, if anything, even more famous than Page's, and it belongs beside his, because the two men were cut from the same cloth. On the night of the 24th of October and into the 25th, a full day and night before Oka struck Page's Ridge, the Sendai Division's main assault crashed into Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Puller's 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines on the southern face of the perimeter. Holding part of that line was a sergeant named John Basilone, in charge of 2 sections of heavy machine guns, the same water-cooled Brownings, with a handful of men and the same impossible task. Wave after wave of Japanese came into position in the rain. His gun crews were ground down until, by some accounts, only Basilone and a couple others were still fighting. He hauled a heavy machine gun and its tripod to a silent section and fired point-blank into the charging enemy. And when his guns ran low, he fought back to the enemy line to bring up more ammunition. Basilone, like Page, received the Medal of Honor for that night and became the first enlisted Marine to earn it in the Second World War. 2 machine gunners of the same regiment, on 2 different faces of the same perimeter, on 2 consecutive nights, each worn down to nearly the last man at his guns, each holding against the same enemy division, and each later decorated by the same general in the same camp in Australia. That the battle for Henderson Field produced 2 such stories side by side is not a coincidence. It is simply what the defense of that airfield demanded of the men who were there. The line held in October because, up and down the perimeter, individual Marines behind individual guns refused to let it break. And the Marines did not hold that southern line alone. Among the men in the foxholes alongside Puller's battalion, that night were soldiers of the United States Army, and theirs is one of the least remembered and most deserving parts of the whole battle. In the second week of October, an American convoy had managed to reach Guadalcanal and put ashore the 164th Infantry Regiment, a National Guard outfit from North Dakota. These were not regular Marines or career soldiers. They were guardsmen, many of them farm boys from small towns across the northern plains, federalized and shipped across the Pacific, and they became the first United States Army unit to fight an offensive action against the enemy in any theater of the entire war. The timing of their arrival is hard to overstate. Just before they landed, on the nights of the 11th and 12th of October, an American naval force had fought a sharp action off Cape Esperance, near the northwestern tip of the island, and gotten the better of a Japanese force, though not cleanly enough to stop the enemy from putting heavy artillery ashore to add to the shelling of Henderson Field. The same contested waters that let those Japanese guns land let the American convoy through, and on the 13th of October, it disgorged the North Dakota Regiment. That added manpower was exactly what General Vandegrift needed to hold his thinly stretched perimeter through the storm that was coming. When the Sendai Division's main assault crashed into the southern line on the night of the 24th, it was a mixed force of Marines and Army Guardsmen that met it. In the dark and the pouring rain, Puller and the commander of the Army Battalion walked the line together, slotting the green North Dakota soldiers into foxholes beside the veteran Marines, mixing the two so that the inexperienced men would have steady hands on either side of them. They held. By the time the assault finally broke, the morning light revealed what the defense had cost the attackers. With the bodies of the Japanese dead lying in the tropical heat in front of the lines, the defenders carried out the grim work of counting them as they buried them. On the southern face alone, the burial details tallied something close to 1,500 dead in and immediately around the lines, and estimated that as many again lay scattered in the jungle beyond. Bulldozers cut long trenches, and the dead were counted and laid in and covered over, a process that went on for 2 full days. Whole Japanese regiments had ceased to exist as effective fighting organizations in a single night of attacks against a line that would not give way. The arithmetic of those burials, repeated up and down the perimeter, is the arithmetic of why the October offensive failed. And it was not only a land battle. On the very same day that Page fought on his saddle, the 26th of October, the American and Japanese fleets collided at sea just north of the Santa Cruz Islands in one of the hardest-fought carrier battles of the entire war. The Japanese Navy had positioned a powerful fleet near the southern Solomons, waiting for the Army to capture Henderson Field, so that aircraft could be flown into the new base. Instead, the carriers traded blows in the open ocean. The Americans lost the carrier Hornet sunk, and the carrier Enterprise badly damaged. By the way that retreat actually unfolded is worth telling, because it is a final measure of what men like Page had done. By the time the Japanese High Command faced reality, the army it had poured onto Guadalcanal had been all but destroyed without ever winning the single decisive battle it kept reaching for. Of the roughly 36,000 troops the Japanese had landed over the course of the campaign, far fewer than half were still fit to fight by the new year. The rest had been killed or wounded or had simply wasted away. The supply situation that the lost naval battles had created meant that the men on the island were starving. They ate roots in the inner bark of trees and whatever else they could find, and they died in the jungle of hunger and of malaria and dysentery in numbers that rivaled the dead from the fighting itself. The Japanese soldiers had a name of their own for the place. They called it Starvation Island. On the last day of 1942, the Emperor himself endorsed the decision to abandon it. The evacuation, codenamed Operation Coup, was a model of its kind, carried out in the face of an enemy who now held the air and, increasingly, the sea. Over a series of nights in late January and early February of 1943, Japanese destroyers ran into the island under cover of darkness and lifted off the survivors. The Japanese Naval Command had feared it might rescue only a third of the men and lose half the destroyers doing it. Instead, through careful timing and deception, it pulled some 11,000 troops off the island at the cost of a single destroyer. The Americans, watching the increased naval activity, mistook it for the build-up to yet another offensive and held back. By the time they understood what had happened, the enemy was gone. There is a quiet irony in that ending, and it lands directly on the men who had held the line in October. The Marines and soldiers who fought through the worst of the campaign never had the satisfaction of a clean, visible victory, of watching a beaten enemy march out under guard, or lay down its arms on the field. The army they had broken on the ridges did not surrender. It slipped away in the dark, secretly, and the men who had stopped it at Henderson Field were left, in a sense, holding an empty jungle. But the outcome was not in doubt. The starving remnant that crept aboard those destroyers was all that was left of the force that had set out, only months before, to throw the Americans into the sea. The ridge above the Matanacaw, the southern line, and the dark water of Iron Bottom Sound had reduced one of the proudest armies in the Pacific to that. It is worth saying plainly what that victory meant, because it is easy to lose a single ridge inside the size of the war that followed. Guadalcanal was the first place in the Pacific where the United States stopped the Japanese advance, and then reversed it. For 6 months, on land, at sea, and in the air, the two sides had poured men and ships and aircraft into fight for one island and its airfield. At the end of the Japanese were the ones who left. After Guadalcanal, the initiative in the Pacific passed to the Americans and never passed back. The long, grinding island campaigns that followed, all the way to the edge of Japan itself, began here in this campaign. The October nights when the perimeter held, Page's Ridge among them, were part of the hinge on which that whole reversal turned. It is a strange thing to set one wounded sergeant stand against a war that spanned an ocean, but the war was made of nights exactly like that one, and it was won in them. It is worth pausing, too, on the price, because it was paid by men on both sides in numbers that are easy to read past. Over the 6 months of the campaign, the Japanese lost most of an army, on the order of 25,000 dead or more, the great majority of them to starvation and disease rather than to American fire. The United States lost far fewer on the ground, but the fighting and the sickness and the long strain of holding the island wore the 1st Marine Division down until it had to be pulled out and rebuilt. At sea, both navies left dozens of ships and thousands of sailors on the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. Guadalcanal was not a clean victory won by clever maneuver. It was a brutal, attritional struggle, fought in mud and malaria and night water, and won because one side could no longer afford to keep paying the price and the other just barely could. Set against the whole war, the meaning of it becomes clearer still. A few months before Guadalcanal, the United States Navy had broken the back of the Japanese carrier fleet at Midway and halted the Japanese advance across the Central Pacific. Guadalcanal did the same thing on land and in the southern seas. Together, Midway and Guadalcanal were the hinge of the Pacific War, the point where the tide that had run unchecked since Pearl Harbor finally stopped and began, slowly and terribly, to turn the other way. Everything that came after, the long climb up to the islands toward Japan itself, began from the simple fact that the Americans had held at Guadalcanal and the Japanese had not been able to push them off. And holding at Guadalcanal was made of exactly the kind of night that Mitchell Page spent on his ridge, multiplied across a perimeter and a campaign. The division that did it paid for the victory with its own substance. The 1st Marine Division had gone ashore in August as a green outfit fighting America's first offensive of the war, and it came off the island months later hollowed out, riddled with malaria, worn past the point of usefulness as a fighting force. It was sent to Australia not for a parade, but be put back together, to rest and heal and absorb thousands of replacements before it could fight again. But something had been forged in those months that outlasted the sickness and the casualty lists. Guadalcanal was where the modern Marine Corps proved, to the country and to itself, what it could do, where a reputation the Corps still carries was hammered out in mud and night fighting against long odds. The men who survived it, Page among them, carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. They had been part of the first place the Japanese were stopped and turned around, and they knew exactly how close it had been and exactly what it had cost. It is one of the reasons the small, specific stories from the campaign matter so much. A war that spanned an ocean and consumed millions of lives can become, in the retelling, a thing of arrows on maps, of fleets and divisions sliding around like pieces on a board. But Guadalcanal was not won by arrows on maps. It was won by a North Dakota farm boy in a foxhole he had been put in an hour before, by a sergeant on the southern line firing a gun he had carried 200 yards through the dark, by sailors who steamed back into Iron Bottom Sound knowing exactly what had happened to men who went before them, and by a wounded platoon sergeant on a saddle above the Matanacaw who would not leave his guns. Strip away the scale and the strategy, and you are left with men, one at a time, deciding to hold. That is what the campaign was actually made of. Mitchell Page did not wait for any of that to be decided before going back to work. His conduct on the ridge was so far beyond the ordinary that the Marine Corps did something it rarely did for an enlisted man. On the 19th of December, 1942, while still on Guadalcanal, he was given a battlefield commission, promoted from platoon sergeant to second lieutenant in the field. The machine gunner who had taught his men to strip their weapons blindfolded was now an officer of Marines. In January of 1943, he left Guadalcanal with the 1st Marine Division, which was pulled out of the line and sent to Australia to rest and refit after months of brutal fighting. It was there, on the 21st of May, 1943, that General Alexander Vandegrift, who had commanded the division through the entire Guadalcanal ordeal, pinned the Medal of Honor on Second Lieutenant Mitchell Page. The citation had been approved by the Congress and signed by the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. In its formal language, it described how Page had commanded his machine gun section with fearless determination, had directed the fire as gunners until every one of them was killed or wounded, had then fought on alone, moving from gun to gun, and keeping up a withering fire against the advancing enemy until reinforcements finally arrived, and had at last led a bayonet charge that drove the enemy back and prevented a breakthrough in the American lines. There is a smaller moment from those weeks that says as much as the citation does. Not long after battle, General Vandegrift sought Page out and told him simply that it had been an important hill and that he and his men had held it. There was no flourish to it, just one Marine acknowledging to another that the ground had mattered and the job had been done. For a man who had watched his entire section fall around him, that recognition from the general who had carried the whole division through Guadalcanal, was its own kind of medal. Page's war did not end on that ridge. He went on with the 1st Marine Division to New Britain, to the fighting at Cape Gloucester at the end of 1943. He was sent home in 1944 and spent the rest of the war passing on what he had learned, training the men who would carry the fight forward to the next chain of islands. When the Korean War came, he was recalled to active duty and served again. He stayed in the Marine Corps for more than 2 decades in all, rising steadily. And when he was placed on a retired list in 1959, he was advanced to colonel for having been specially commended for performance of duty in actual combat. From an 18-year-old who stood on a Pennsylvania sidewalk watching the old soldiers march on Armistice Day, to a platoon sergeant alone behind a gun in the rain, to a colonel of Marines. He lived a long time after the war, and he spent a good part of it guarding the thing he had earned. He wrote a book about his experiences, and he took up an unusual private crusade, tracking down impostors who falsely claimed to have received a Medal of Honor, and helping push for stronger laws against the fraud, defending the meaning of the decoration he had paid for in the worst hours of his life. He had qualified decades earlier as an Eagle Scout, and late in life he was formally recognized as one of the small handful of men to hold both that rank and the Medal of Honor. When he died on the 15th of November, 2003, at the age of 85, he was the last living Medal of Honor recipient from the ground battle for Guadalcanal. He was buried with full military honors at Riverside National Cemetery in California. That last fight, the one against the impostors, occupied him for the better part of 40 years. He had earned the Medal of Honor in a single night of combat that had cost his section everything, and it galled him to see men who had risked nothing with the same ribbon for the attention or the standing it brought them. He worked with investigators to expose the frauds, and the effort he was part helped lead in time to tougher federal penalties for falsely claiming the decoration. It was an unusual second career for a retired colonel, but it came from the same place the stand on the ridge had come from. He took the thing seriously. He believed it meant something, and he believed that meaning was worth defending. His own recognition came in scattered pieces across the decades. He wrote a memoir of his years in the Corps. A museum exhibit was dedicated to him. A school was eventually named for him. And in 1998, he became the model for one figure in a line of toys honoring Medal of Honor recipients, a small and slightly improbable kind of immortality. And in the spring of 2003, only months before he died, the Boy Scouts of America formally presented him with the rank of Eagle Scout, which he had qualified for back in 1936, in his last year of high school, and never collected, because he had left home to walk to Baltimore and become a Marine. The boy who had watched the parade closed the circle at the very end. It is worth, near the close, returning once more to the man who held the southern line on the night before Page held the western ridge, because the two stories that began so alike did not end the same way. John Basilone, the sergeant who had hauled his gun to the dark and fought on after his crews were down, was sent home a hero after Guadalcanal, his Medal of Honor making him famous across the country. He was put to work selling war bonds, kept carefully away from the fighting, celebrated wherever he went, and he hated it. He asked, again and again, to be sent back to the war, back to Marines he felt he belonged with. Eventually the Corps relented. On the 19th of February, 1945, more than 2 years after Guadalcanal, Sergeant John Basilone went ashore with the assault on the black sand of Iwo Jima, and he was killed there on the first day, under fire, leading men forward. He was 28. Mitchell Page lived. He came home from his war, served on through Korea, retired a colonel, and grew old. He buried comrades and watched the century turn, and died in his own bed at 85, the last man alive who had received the Medal of Honor for ground fighting on Guadalcanal. 2 machine gunners of the same regiment, decorated for 2 consecutive nights of the same battle, and the war handed them opposite endings. One went back into the fire and stayed there. One carried the weight of survival for 60 more years, and spent a good part of that time guarding the honor of the medal they had both earned. There is no lesson in which fate was the better one. There is only the fact that men like these existed, that they did what they did on specific nights on a specific island, and that almost none of them ever asked to be remembered for it. That is exactly why the remembering falls to the rest of us. Which brings us back to the saddle, and to the question the knight had asked. Could a single section of guns keep the door to the airfield from being kicked open? For most of those hours, the honest answer hung in the balance. And for the worst stretch of it, the answer came down to one man who refused to leave his guns. He was not, in the strict sense, alone. His men had fought beside him until they could not, and the company came down the hill behind him at the end. But there were minutes, real minutes in the dark before dawn, when the line that held the western approach to Henderson Field was one wounded sergeant moving from weapon to weapon, firing into the rain, buying time with the only currency he had left, which was himself. The door stayed shut. The road stayed closed. And because it did, the men sleeping behind that ridge and the planes on that battered airfield and a campaign that turned the entire tide of the Pacific War all lived to see the next morning. There is a temptation with a story like this one to round it up into a single man defeating an army, because that version fits on a thumbnail and a man holding a line by himself is easy to picture. The real story is quieter and harder and, in the end, more worth telling. A section of guns, cited by a sergeant who knew his trade. A trip wire strung in the rain out of ration cans. 33 men who held until they fell. A line behind them that bent and very nearly broke. And one wounded man who, when there was no one left and a clear road behind him to everything that mattered, chose to pick up a machine gun and walk toward the enemy rather than let the door swing open. He did not do it for a medal he could not have known was coming. He did it because the ground behind him led to the airfield. And the airfield was the war, and someone had to hold the saddle until the sun came up. He held it. Then he went back to work, and he lived a long life. And for the rest of it, he tried to make sure that the decoration he earned in those hours kept its meaning. The men who fight battles like this one rarely think of themselves as heroes. They think of the man on the next gun, and of the job that has to be done before dawn. That is usually all it takes. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.